Hi, everyone. I'm here again with Dr. Geert Vanden. Thank you so much for joining us again. So it's been a number of months since I've spoken to you, and I saw that you published a book, but I'm not sure if it's actually available. There were some issues with Amazon. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what's going on. It's difficult to believe that this is censorship because the book is really entirely scientific. Some people, though, pretend or sure that it has been censored, but it could also be due to the fact that we published the book in Europe and it's also distributed by Amazon, and that the account in the US is different. So the same book, same title, same author, etc., and two different accounts. Maybe this was like violating an algorithm at the Amazon administration. I don't know. Strange thing is that we have asked Amazon multiple times to clarify this, and we have not gotten any concrete answer. I still don't know why it is not available through Amazon in the US. But we are working on this, and within the next few days, we will come, I think, with a big advertisement where the book is available. Of course, we have found other alternative solutions with the help of many other people. And I can say that for sure, the book will be broadly available, not only in the US, but in different parts of the world. But of course, due to this issue, the publication, at least not in Europe, but in other countries, has been unfortunately delayed.
Do you have a website that you're ready to tell people to go to?
People can find the book when they go on my website. They will immediately bump into it. It's just that we have put a number of links where the book is available. It's just that those links are not complete because we are still making it available through other channels that we have not announced yet because it's not entirely finalized. We will then also make people aware through social media, etc. And I'm sure there will also be promotional campaigns. So the book will be promoted in the US. So in one way or the other, people will become aware of the publication of this book. But for now, the best thing is probably to consult my website where they will automatically bump into the book. It's on the front page of the website.
That's a voiceforscienceandsolidarity.org. And
exactly.
The book is The Inescapable Immune Escape. Yeah. So can you tell us basically the theme of this book and what I know that I've spoken to you before, and I do want to ask you if there's any new information that you'd like to tell people. Let's just start with the book and what's the argument of the book and the conclusion?
First of all, with regard to the title, I think that the title is pretty rich in the sense that pandemics, a normal natural pandemic that is not influenced by human intervention, is never a pandemic of variants. Like in 1918, when we had the flu pandemic, the variant or the lineage that started the pandemic was exactly the same than the lineage that was forced into endemicity at the end of the pandemic. Of course, you always have variants, but none of these variants became dominant. This has been very different during this pandemic, where we have seen alpha, beta, gamma, delta, Omicron, not only emerged, but they also became dominant. So if you talk about an immune escape pandemic, a pandemic of immune escape variants, you automatically know that you're no longer talking about a natural pandemic. That is one thing. And the second thing is that I've been saying all along, and I continue saying this, that the virus is still further evolving, that is no longer under control, that we don't have herd immunity, and that, in fact, the outcome of this pandemic is inescapable in the sense that nature will now determine where this will end. I'm not very positive about the outcome of this pandemic. It is true that I have been predicting that the virus would become more virulent and that I was wrong with regard to the timeline. I am also explaining in my book why I have been wrong with regard to the timeline, why this timeline has been delayed, and basically while the immune system was catching up. But this doesn't change my opinion, my prediction with regard to the final outcome, that the virus will evolve to a more virulent form. And I'm also explaining this based on immunological concepts and the rationale why this is the case. But this is the explanation of the title, the inescapable, it's a pandemic, we will not escape this, the inescapable immune escape pandemic, an inescapable pandemic of immune escape variants.
I think the most interesting thing that you said was about the timeline being wrong. Can you tell us a little more about why the timeline may have been wrong?
Yeah, just to keep things very simple, I have covered a phenomenon that obviously nobody's paying attention to, and I call it, is explained really in detail in the book, I call it SIR, which is the abbreviation for steric immune refocusing. If you want to keep it very simple, just think about immune refocusing. And in fact, what that means is that because of the vaccine breakthrough infections, remember, these are typically the people who were vaccinated, exposed to Omicron and got symptoms. This is what we call the vaccine breakthrough infections. As a consequence of vaccine breakthrough infections, the immune response is reoriented to epitopes that are different from the immune dominant epitopes. So the immune dominant epitopes of spike are the epitopes that elicit the classical antibodies, I would say. And subdominant domains, they cannot elicit antibodies because they are outcompeted by the dominant epitopes. That makes sense. That is also why they are called dominant epitopes. But what happens is if you have a breakthrough infection, that neutralizing antibodies that per definition do not longer fully neutralize the virus, they can still attach to these dominant epitopes. And by attaching to these dominant epitopes, they will, of course, mask these dominant epitopes so that now these subdominant epitopes can be recognized by the immune system. And these are typically the subdominant epitopes that are going to elicit what has been described in the literature, the broadly neutralizing antibodies. Remember that when people got breakthrough infections, for example, all of a sudden they got protected, not only against the disease, but even against the infection. But this protection did not last for very long, just a few weeks, because per definition, antibodies, even though they are broadly neutralizing, that are directed against subdominant epitopes, are weak. The immunogenicity is weak, and therefore the virus can easily overcome this immune protection. That is why SIR, steric immune refocusing, at the end of the day is going to expedite immune escape. But of course, not before you have had a period of additional protection because of this broadly neutralizing effect. This broadly neutralizing effect has been, of course, delaying the evolution of the virus, has been protecting vaccinees against infection so that the evolution of the virus got delayed. And that is like explaining why the immune system could catch up at least for some time before continuing the immune escape, which is going on right now. It's very clear that the virus continues to evolving. We have all these different variants of Omicron. And so ultimately, this is not going to change the course of the pandemic, of the evolutionary dynamics. But because of this phenomenon, immune refocusing, it has been delayed. Immune refocusing is a phenomenon that we as vaccinologists know very well, because you know that dominant epitopes used to be very variable. And that is annoying when you make vaccines. You want to make vaccines that protect against a number of several different variants. So what people have been trying to do artificially is to mask those dominant variable epitopes to enable subdominant epitopes to induce immune responses, because these subdominant epitopes are usually much more conserved, and hence induce antibodies that protect against a broader and a more diversified spectrum of variants. So we know this from the vaccine business, but that it is also can also be naturally induced when manipulate the pandemic by inducing antibodies, neutralizing antibodies that after a while do no longer sufficiently recognize the dominantly circulating variant, but mask the dominant epitopes, you have the same effect as subdominant epitopes that are conserved. They now induce broadly neutralizing antibodies. And many experts, many health authorities have been very excited about this because they were saying, yeah, of course, there is breakthrough effects, but wait a minute. First of all, people are still protected against severe disease. And you know what? They are now even protected against infection. But it was very clear that it didn't last for a long time, just lasted for a few weeks, for example. And we have seen, by the way, the same thing with the mRNA vaccines. I'm also explaining in my book, it's rather complex, why the mRNA vaccines, in contrast to all the other COVID-19 vaccines, are in fact promoting refocusing to happen. So in fact, this immune escape is much more pronounced if you mass vaccinate populations with mRNA vaccines.
Interesting. So I think we should go back just one step. And can you explain why doesn't a natural pandemic lead to immune escape? Like, why doesn't the virus evolve variants that escape a natural immune response? And why do we see so many variants and continued evolution of variants when we're vaccinating everyone with just one vaccine? It's not like we're chasing the variants. We did develop these boosters, but just one booster, right? It's not every month we're injecting people with a new. So can you explain why the natural one doesn't trigger immune escape and why there's continued variants just like popping up every few months?
The most straightforward principle, the only thing you need to understand basically to catch this difference is that variants and mutants that of course pop up all the time, especially with coronaviruses, that have not these correcting functions, that you will see mutants as the virus replicates, you will automatically see mutants. But it's only when the mutant, when a variant gains a competitive advantage compared to the original lineage that it will become dominant. Okay, so that depends on the environment. If the environment is hostile, some mutants may happen to be able to replicate in that hostile environment much better than the original lineage. And then, of course, this variant becomes dominant. If this is not the case, because you have not simultaneously, I would say, immunized your population, you have not this massive hostile environment where a large majority of the population within a short time frame mounts an immune response. This immune response, this herd immune response is, of course, a hostile environment for the virus. And I'm talking about an environment because it's massive. It's not like just when you vaccinate 5% of the population, you cannot talk about a hostile immune environment. If you start vaccinating 60, 70, 80% of the population, that's a different story. You don't have this, for example, during a natural pandemic, then there is the variants that pop up have no competitive advantage compared to the original lineage that started the pandemic. That explains why you will have several waves, 2, 3 waves, and then you develop systematically your herd immunity in the population, and then ultimately this original lineage will be driven into endemicity. It will be kept under control. That is very different, of course, when you all of a sudden, within a short time frame, you're going to vaccinate massively large cohorts of the population. That is where, of course, some of these variants start to have a competitive advantage. So they not only emerge, but they also gain a competitive advantage and start to dominate. That is why all of a sudden when Gamma, Delta, Omicron popped up, within no time, they became dominant. So now what is very important to understand is that when Omicron emerged, that we started to have, in fact, massively vaccine breakthrough infections. Of course, people were protected against severe disease, vaccinees, but many of them developed mild or moderate disease, had symptoms. And as I was just saying, these vaccine breakthrough infections, they are driving immune refocusing. And because of the immune refocusing, remember, inducing broadly neutralizing antibodies, but of weak affinity, weak antibodies, they in fact promoted immune escape. Due to the vaccine breakthrough infections elicited by Omicron, we have in fact expedited this immune escape. which means that you have more variants. In the literature, the molecular epidemiologists call this large-scale immune escape, because now we have the immune escape at a very large scale with many more variants, which also explains why within the Omicron family we have many variants. It's just expediting this. And that is also the reason why I said, because of the emergence of Omicron, this path towards an uncontrolled viral evolution has been carved in stone, and it is irreversible. So the appearance, the emergence of Omicron has led to a point of no return, which means that even if at that very point we had stopped the mass vaccination, we would not have been able to interrupt or to abrogate the course of the pandemic that is now used to evolve. Of course, if on top you continue the mass vaccination and you even start to vaccinate additional groups of the population, like children, etc., you may further expedite this, but you're not going to be able to change fundamentally the course of the pandemic. Omicron, in contrast to what many people were saying, Omicron is a blessing. I always said Omicron is a scourge, because it's just going to expedite immune escape and turn it into large-scale immune escape, which has happened and which is still going on. And therefore, Omicron is really a point of no return in this pandemic, a very sad event, really.
Can you explain in more detail why you're saying Omicron was the point of no return? What's special about Omicron?
Is in fact that this is now self-fueling the immune escape. Right? And Omicron was more infectious, so it circulates. And because it is causing vaccine breakthrough infections, and because the vaccine breakthrough infections lead to immune refocusing, and because immune refocusing is promoting immune escape, Omicron is self-fueling the immune escape. And therefore, once you have Omicron in the population circulating, it's a point of no return with regard to further evolution of the virus, the evolutionary dynamics, and with regard to the immune escape. Of course, we still have protection against severe disease, that is still there, and also the unvaccinated are better and better protected against disease because they have developed their natural immunity. So clinically speaking, if you don't talk about side effects, if you don't talk about diseases due to immune suppression linked to the vaccination, it is quite calm. But behind the scenes, the virus continuing to evolve. And that is not just me saying, this is very clearly documented by publications from molecular epidemiologists, etc., that we continue to have this diversified spectrum and amplification of that spectrum of all kinds of subvariants, right? And that is where I'm saying that this is evolving into a direction that I think is not very favorable, to say it in a very euphemistic way.
So we're not changing the environment anymore. So why does it continue to evolve when the environment has become stable in a sense? So it's infected most people, I would assume at this point, vaxxed and unvaxxed, and then it comes back and infects them again. But their immune system hasn't really changed. So why would it be continuing to evolve when the environment that it's in isn't really changing at this point?
The biggest gap in the understanding of the pandemic is the lack of insight in the immunology, because we think that the virus is evolving. That has been very much the position of the WHO. The more the virus replicates, the more you have mutants, etc. And they have been assuming that the immune system is not evolving, but the immune system is evolving as well, in the sense that you have antibodies that better protect against infection, protect against, or that antibodies that neutralize. Then we have had, especially with Omicron, just to your question, just to show you how the immune response, the adaptive immune response is evolving. This has been published by a number of folks that when you have antibodies that lose their neutralizing capacity, because with Omicron, for example, with Omicron, all of a sudden we had 30 mutations or even more within the spike protein, the receptor binding domain, etc., which dramatically diminished the neutralizing capacity of the vaccinal antibodies. And that has led to the production of non-neutralizing antibodies. So again, another environment, these non-neutralizing antibodies are most likely, I'm explaining this in detail in my book, are most likely the cause why people are still protected against severe disease, for example, because there is a phenomenon that we call transinfection, and that is in fact hampered, that is inhibited by these antibodies. When the virus evolves, and I was talking about the variants that have popped up once Omicron emerged, where you had immune refocusing, you had these variants again reinfect, and then because of this reinfection, you have, for example, more of these non-neutralizing antibodies that inhibit virulence, etc. So these systems are evolving in parallel. And what we see right now are still a number of mutations. And again, not me saying this, the molecular epidemiologists, they agree that we see this evolution because of population level immune pressure. What they don't tell you is that this population level immune pressure is largely due to, in fact, mass vaccination, because it was the mass vaccination that led to resistance to the neutralizing antibodies. The biggest example was Omicron. Omicron was the fruit of resistance to neutralizing antibodies. So the Omicron started to circulate as a result of the mass vaccination. Omicron itself fueled the immune escape. So the variants that we are now seeing are indirectly still the consequence of the mass vaccination. And this is evolving because the environment is evolving, because the immune protection is largely driven by the non-neutralizing antibodies. Remember, how funny is this? This is something everybody should understand. Viruses, coronavirus, influenza virus, we know that the protection is usually due to neutralizing antibodies. That is very easy. These are very easy viruses in that regard. You have neutralizing antibodies, you can neutralize the virus, you are protected. It's very easy. Now, everybody agrees. We know that the neutralizing antibodies, so to say, are no longer protective. On top, the virus has become more infectious than before. And still, people are protected against severe disease, and to a large extent, even against disease. I'm not talking about other diseases than corona, than COVID-19, right? So something very weird that we don't understand is going on. We still have some protection due to immune responses. Nobody really understands how it is possible that we are still protected. And then people come with T cells and all this kind of ridiculous stuff that I have been rejecting. Also in my book, I'm again explaining that this protection is not due to cross-reactive T cells. So I'm explaining the underlying immunological adaptation or evolution that still enables to keep the virus under control. The question is, the real question is this immune protection that people are benefiting from right now, is this robust? Does it have memory? And will it be prolonged? And there the answer is no, it will not. And that is why the virus will be able to overcome this and further evolve. And my prediction, the reason why I'm saying this is all explained in the book, is because the virus can escape to the non-neutralizing antibodies that inhibit the virulence of the virus by evolving glycans, sugars. Nobody has been talking about the sugars, and you have to imagine that 30 to 50% of the virus is covered by sugars that have a tremendous impact on the immunogenicity, on immune inflammatory events, etc. And there is clear evidence now that there are sites on the virus where these glycan chains can still expand, can mask a whole region of peptides, mask it and make it escape also from immune responses, for example, from the non-neutralizing antibodies. So this is very complex, but the virus is evolving because of population immune pressure. That means that also the immunity of the host, of the population, is evolving. And it is this interplay that causes the dynamics of this whole thing. So it's not only the evolution of the virus that is dynamic, it's also the immune protection that is dynamic. Usually this simply leads to herd immunity, but in this case, of course, as we all know, we don't have herd immunity because the most prominent characteristic of herd immunity is that you dampen the infectiousness, viral infectivity. That is not what's happening. The virus is still spreading. It's still broadly spreading. You're dealing with a type of population immunity that is not generating herd immunity, that is nevertheless, for the time being, protecting people against severe disease. And that is why the subtitle of my book is also that highly vaccinated societies will be caught by surprise, because it's like the calm before the storm. The virus continues to evolve, but we are not seeing it because these non-neutralizing antibodies, for the time being, are still protecting against severe disease and to some extent to disease. It's very difficult to explain this, and that is basically why I wrote the book. I want this to be clearly documented so that people can argue and say, "Ah, Geert, you're not right. Look at this argument. I don't agree," etc., etc. But I wanted to avoid that anybody could say, "Oh, we didn't know that this was unpredictable," etc. Conclusion of my book is really that from the very beginning, nothing was more predictable than that mass vaccination during a pandemic would have detrimental consequences. And I think that is really very well documented in the book based on science. And therefore, it could be that people will censor the book because of the title, maybe, but they can certainly not censor it because of the content.
I want to go back to something you just said about herd immunity and the way that it works. You said that it works by suppressing the infectivity. And even I'm a physician, and even my not deep understanding of immunology at all compared to yours, but this kind of like general understanding that people have is that, for example, we think of the cold, right? Common cold. And we think that it's very infectious, but just not very severe. So are you saying that we're suppressing the infectivity of all the viruses that go through the population every year?
That is, of course, typically what happens. The virus is infectious. It will spread in the population and people will develop immunity. But the thing that is completely misunderstood about herd immunity is that you would never, ever, for this type of viruses, when you talk about common cold, corona, influenza, enteroviruses, a number of these viruses that are typically causing acute self-limiting infections, there is one aspect that is completely ignored, certainly by vaccinologists, which is innate immunity. You have to imagine, innate immunity is very important. Coronaviruses came to our countries. Nobody had ever seen it. The population was immunologically naive. And guess what? 80–90% of the population was not suffering from it. Yeah, of course, maybe some mild symptoms, maybe some people were for a few days in bed, etc. And many people, young people, children, didn't even have symptoms. So how can it be that a foreign pathogen invades our countries, our continents, and that people can easily resist it? This is because of the innate immunity. And the innate immunity takes away the bulk of the viral load, so there is only a minority of viral particles that need to be dealt with the adaptive immunity. And so this is something that is very well trained when the virus spreads through the population. It's not something, this innate immunity, the cell-based innate immunity, you cannot train with vaccines. The vaccines are, of course, eliciting adaptive immunity. And that is when people compare, it makes me sick, really. People compare the antibodies that are elicited by the vaccines, which are usually eliciting high titers of neutralizing antibodies, compared to the antibodies elicited by natural infection, usually much lower. Why are these titers much lower during natural infection? Because the bulk of the viral load is taken out by the innate immunity. That is sterilizing, that is recognizing several different variants. It's not variant specific. And therefore, the antigenic stimulus of the adaptive immune system is minor because most of the virus has already been taken out. That is also the reason why the titers are lower. This illustrates the efficiency of the innate immune system and why the titers are declining much faster. But vaccinologists are saying, because they don't understand innate immunity, they're saying, yeah, you see, the titers are much lower, so it's much less efficient natural immunity. But it's thanks to this innate immunity that we manage to have this herd immunity, because herd immunity is not about the antibodies. Herd immunity means that you diminish the level of transmission in your population to an extent such that even people who are immunologically completely naive are protected because the likelihood for them to get infected is so low because of the low transmission rate. It has to do with the transmission rate. So what we see right now with all this vaccination, of course, health authorities are saying, oh yeah, we have the immunity due to natural infection. And then on top, we have the vaccines. So you put all this together, you have hybrid immunity, very sexy word. Nobody knows what exactly it means. And it's all about immunity. No, the parameter for herd immunity is the transmission rate. And the transmission rate remains very high. Remember, the viruses that are still circulating right now, the Omicron subvariants, are highly infectious, right? So we don't diminish this infection rate at all. So the other golden rule that everybody can and should understand is that you will never, ever end a pandemic when you cannot dramatically diminish the transmission rate. That is why this pandemic is now simply continuing. And the pandemic is not under control, which is very scary. This virus is evolving, and health authorities, even scientists, don't know where this is going, right? And this is very scary, of course.
So people who were vaccinated, their innate immunity would be trained by an infection, correct?
This is a very good question. It's all explained in detail in my book. Yes and no. Some people, indeed, who will have gotten vaccines will still be able to develop their innate immunity and to train it. And I'm describing which category of vaccinees this will be. It all depends on the type of vaccines. I already mentioned that the mRNA vaccines can, in regard of their immunogenicity, etc., immunological impact, not be compared at all with other COVID-19 vaccines. It also depends on how many shots that you have gotten. It also depends whether you have been exposed to the virus before you got vaccinated, etc. People, the vast majority have been vaccinated with mRNA vaccines, but a minority of vaccinees will indeed still be able to develop and to train their innate immunity to the same extent as the unvaccinated. But this phenomenon of immune refocusing is also sidelining the innate immune system. And that is very dramatic, because if that happens, if immune refocusing happens, the innate immune system can no longer be trained, and the training can even be abrogated, so that these people can no longer rely on their innate immunity, which is a huge problem, because as we were saying, the vaccinal antibodies, the so to say neutralizing antibodies, do no longer protect. And if the non-neutralizing antibodies are also going to lose their protection, the only thing you can rely on is trained innate immunity. And that is what the unvaccinated are doing. And that is why you're now seeing that fewer and fewer unvaccinated people contract infection and contract the disease, right? That is thanks to the trained innate immunity. If you don't have this, and in some vaccinees, it's prevented, it can no longer happen, then you're not in good shape.
Can you explain why the mRNA shots are worse than the DNA or any other?
I will try to explain this as good as I can. Good means in as simple words as I can. You have to imagine a virus infects a cell. Now, I'm not talking about the mRNA. I'm talking about virus infection, right? Coronavirus infects a cell. You will have, of course, spike protein that at some point during the replication of the virus is presented at the membrane of the cell. At that point, it's in a kind of premature stage because the spike needs to envelope the nucleocapsid and then it will bud from the infected cell, etc. This is a whole process. But in a premature stage, it's first of all expressed at the surface of the infected cell. Now, you tell me, is there any reason why the immune system should not recognize this premature stage of spike protein? No, this is a foreign protein. The immune system should recognize it. Nevertheless, it is not recognized during natural infection. Why not? Because together with, of course, all the information that the virus carries to produce and express the spike protein, there are also other peptides that will prevent antigen presentation, that will prevent stimulation of T cells. So that means that although the S protein is expressed at the surface of the infected cell, the immune system is not going to really recognize it because the antigen presentation is blocked by certain peptides that are comprised also within the virus. mRNA vaccines don't have these other peptides. So the premature stage of the spike protein can be recognized. And as a matter of fact, it will produce low affinity antibodies. And these low affinity antibodies will be able to mask the dominant epitopes, but will not be able to neutralize it. That is how the mRNA vaccines in their own right promote immune refocusing and therefore will dramatically stimulate immune escape and will also make it much more likely to avoid or to sideline the innate immune system so that it cannot be trained. So steric immune refocusing has two major impacts: that it expedites immune escape, and secondarily, that it sidelines the innate immune system. So that is the reason why mRNA vaccines, in contrast to the other COVID-19 vaccines, are not only causing all the side effects that everybody's talking about, but immunologically speaking, it drives immune refocusing because it enables the immune system to produce low affinity antibodies against this premature spike protein expressed on the membrane of transfected cells, whereas this expression also occurs during natural infection, but it cannot be recognized because the immune system is paralyzed by other peptides that the virus presents. That is important because if the virus would not do this, viral replication already at an early stage of infection would be compromised. So that is just in a nutshell side. One of the main messages of my book is really, guys, this is way more complex than you are trying to make people believe, right? This is a very complex interplay between the immune system and the virus at a population level, massively influenced by human intervention, which humans not knowing really what you're doing, no longer being in control, but nevertheless continuing this mass vaccination and continuing to try to convince people to vaccinate themselves and their children. So that is just unacceptable and unbelievable.
So the DNA shots would work the same way, right? They would have the same weakness?
No, they would not have the same. Remember, the mRNA in the mRNA vaccines has been manipulated to be very stable, right? By the DNA vaccines, the mRNA, there has not been special treatments, stabilization of the mRNA, so it will be degraded by the time, because if the virus cell is transfected, it presents a spike protein, and then ultimately it will, of course, release the full-fledged spike protein. And it is that full-fledged spike protein that will be taken up by antigen-presenting cells, and these antigen-presenting cells will stimulate T helper cells that will enable the recognition of the spike protein. But by the time, with the DNA vaccines, by the time the spike protein gets taken up by antigen-presenting cells to drive this T help, the mRNA will already be degraded. Not with the mRNA vaccines, because it has specifically been stabilized, right, to have prolonged expression of the spike protein. There are some studies where they have been comparing the DNA vaccines with the mRNA in terms of immune refocusing. Of course, they don't call it immune refocusing, but with regard, I would say, to induction of these broadly neutralizing antibodies that happened with the mRNA vaccines, but not with the others.
So there's something about the immune system that I'm not understanding. So why does it matter that the mRNA that the DNA creates is broken down quickly? How does that make a difference in terms of the immune response? Because the spike protein is presented on the surface of the cell in both cases, whether you get the mRNA or the DNA shot. And then in both cases, it's taken up and given to the antigen.
Yeah, sure. But the thing is, so S protein is presented, we agree, in both cases. And then the full-fledged spike is released from that transfected cell, right? And by the time this full-fledged spike protein gets taken up by antigen-presenting cells to drive T help, the S protein with the DNA vaccines is no longer expressed at the surface of the cell, but it is still expressed at the surface of the mRNA transfected cell because that mRNA has been stabilized. When the T help comes, this expression that should normally be temporary is still present with the mRNA vaccines, is no longer present in case of the DNA vector vaccines, and is not present anymore during natural infection either. So that is the difference. Yeah, I'm really sorry to take these shortcuts during this interview, but this a full chapter in my book.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading it. I actually need to review my immunology here, but with the DNA shots, you're taking this piece of the spike protein that's stuck on the surface of the cell and you're presenting it to these other cells, the T helper cells. And so they're being trained on that. But in the case of the mRNA shots, they're coming back once they've taken up this piece of the spike protein. And now they're also being trained on a different version of the spike protein that's still stuck on the surface of the cell because it keeps producing it. It doesn't stop.
Yeah.
So that changes the final immune response that you get.
Yeah, because what happens is, in the case of the transfected cell, we are talking about mRNA, you induce T help while your S protein is still expressed in a kind of premature stage at the surface of the transfected cell, right? That's this combination of the T help recognizing this premature spike protein at the surface of the transfected cell will induce low affinity antibodies to spike protein, of course, to the immunodominant epitopes. Those will then be masked by the low affinity antibodies to the same extent as I explained you when you have vaccine breakthrough infections. The reason is different. There you have low affinity binding because these antibodies do not recognize very well the immunodominant epitopes. That's the reason why you got vaccine breakthrough infection. With the DNA, of course, the DNA will need also to produce the mRNA. The mRNA will produce the protein, etc. But that mRNA is degradable. It has not been treated to become very stable. With mRNA, it has been treated, people have been intervened to make some changes so that it's more stable. By the time the full-fledged S protein is secreted, taken up by the antigen-presenting cells, they can provide T help, but they can no longer provide T help to this premature S protein because it's no longer expressed at the surface of the, infected by the vector. So that is the difference. And that is a very important difference. And I'm pretty much convinced this is the case because all this translates into, do you induce indeed broadly neutralizing antibodies with the mRNA vaccines? Yes, you do. That's why people have been so excited. Remember, in Israel, they have been revaccinating the people with these mRNA vaccines and they got broadly neutralizing antibodies. But guess what? After 4 to 6 weeks, it diminished. And then after 2 weeks, it diminished, etc. This has not been observed with the DNA vaccines. And what I'm really doing is that I'm formulating my hypothesis based on my knowledge of 30 years of vaccinology and immunology. And then I've been reading all these publications to see whether the results that have been generated by the biochemical analysis of the antibodies and the biological analysis of the antibodies and also the sequencing match with that hypothesis. That is how, and I think it's important, because if nobody makes predictions, and if you're simply saying people just continue vaccination, don't ask me where this is going. We have no clue, but all we know is that the virus continues to replicate and mutates, and that it's all unpredictable. That is bad news for society, very bad news.
So you said that that at this point, your prediction for when this would get worse has not arrived yet. And people have a few weeks of additional protection. So that doesn't sound as though it would delay the timeline very much. Why? You were, I think, warning people months ago that this was going to get very bad. So is it getting bad in some people now? If people only have a few weeks of that additional protection, are we still waiting for the variant to develop?
This is a very smart question. So I realize that I need to take it one step further for you. The few weeks I was talking about, because of the immune refocusing, do not explain the months of delay that I would have to justify. There is another phenomenon now. The immune pressure, as I explained you, does no longer come from the neutralizing antibodies. It comes from the non-neutralizing antibodies. And for reasons that I explain in detail also in my book, that immune pressure mounts much, much slower, right? Which is the reason why my predictions may be considerably delayed, but it's very important, I think, to realize that what we are seeing right now, increased hospitalizations, right? Maybe, Said, it's clear to you, but it's not clear to me what this is really due to. I do not rule out that this is already the prelude of what I'm predicting, right? You can imagine, if you talk about a huge wave, you talk about the changes of the virus having achieved a kind of overall change that is sufficient to break through the overall immune pressure. But this does not rule out that in some people, it is already breaking through their immunity. And that could be cases where people come to the clinic and are hospitalized because of COVID. I think we cannot rule it out, because even if they don't have respiratory symptoms, if there is a change in virulence, the virus could as well affect other organs than the lung. And so are these people now hospitalized because of other diseases, immune suppression, side effects? Are these really the first signs of a virus that is starting to become more virulent? We know that in vitro, the virus is already more virulent. We know that. But of course, in vitro, you don't have the non-neutralizing antibodies. The non-neutralizing antibodies are in vivo, so they are still keeping the virus under control. But definitely, there is already a change in virulence. And I think it's very difficult right now to say you got hospitalized and the symptoms are not classical COVID. Yeah, but of course, the phenotypic behavior of the virus has completely changed. Look at all the mutations. If we now start with regard to infectivity, with regard to neutralizability, and now with regard to virulence. So this is a completely different virus, right? And we know that it can affect, of course, other organs, that it's not limited to the respiratory tract. So it seems like everything is mixing up right now. And I know you're very much interested in studying long COVID. Frankly speaking, I think it's very difficult to say what is really the cause of this chronic illness that people are developing, because normally also this virus is eliminated. Acute self-limiting infection, that means you get a disease, but after a number of days, a week, 10 days, the virus is completely eliminated via cytotoxic T cells. But if this elimination is now compromised, you may no longer develop really cytolytic T cells, but for example, T cells that are not cytolytic. And that could produce a number of inflammatory cytokines, etc., that lead to chronic inflammatory infection. I'm always saying in all diseases, in all pathology, where you have immune inflammatory disorders or autoimmunity, you always have T cells, particularly CD4 T cells that are involved, not cytolytic T cells, but T cells that are producing cytokines, etc., inflammatory cytokines. It's very clear that the immune system got completely dysregulated, and that may entail a number of inflammatory symptoms that could be caused chronic. Why also chronic? Because of the continuous reinfection. These people are reinfected all the time, even if they have barely any symptoms right now. They are reinfected. That's why I'm always saying what we have is not herd immunity. What we have is herd susceptibility. People have become more susceptible to reinfection, even though it seems, and we are not much testing anymore, and people are developing less symptoms, so to say. So we have the impression that they are no longer really infected at high frequency. But we know that this virus, the variants circulating right now, and since Omicron, are highly infectious.
I guess some people think that the people who were really highly susceptible, they died in the beginning, right? The elderly, we pulled forward some deaths that would have happened in the next few years, and they happened early on in the pandemic. So now whoever's left are the people who are less susceptible. And I think you've changed your mind at certain points. I think I remember initially you saying that this immune escape that you're predicting will happen and become far more virulent would be dangerous both for the vaxxed and the unvaxxed. And then I think later you said that it would primarily be the vaccinated who would be at risk. So do you agree that we pulled forward some deaths in the susceptible and the remaining population is less susceptible to this, or not? And do you still think that it's only the vaxxed who are at risk, or do you think it's everyone?
If there is one thing, Sai, that people should try to understand, is that this whole phenomenon is dynamic. So if I was saying that the virus becoming more infectious because of mass vaccination was a risk to the unvaccinated, that was completely true. And a lot of unvaccinated people have suffered and have contracted the disease. And remember, I'm the first to say that at the very beginning, at the outset, the vaccinated, the vaccinees were much better protected than the unvaccinated. But then you have seen how things evolve, because the unvaccinated started to develop more and better trained innate immunity. So you would say, okay, they were better protected. No, not really true, because when Omicron came, many unvaccinated contracted the disease, and some were really, I'm not saying severely ill, but they were seriously ill. They had to stay in bed for it. So what happened? What happened is that many of these people were still sitting on their Delta antibodies, okay? And then Omicron came, and of course, the Delta antibodies did not very well recognize Omicron, because Omicron had, of course, had a number of important mutations. So these antibodies could still bind to Omicron, the Delta antibodies, but could not neutralize it, and instead they led to enhancement of disease, right? This could only happen provided somebody got infected with Omicron before the Delta antibodies had sufficiently declined. When do you get a situation like this? You get a situation like this when you have high infectious pressure. When you have a high infection rate, then the likelihood that you become re-exposed shortly after you had your Delta infection becomes more likely. So the fact that the unvaccinated contracted disease was due to the high infection rate in the population, and that high infection rate from alpha, beta, gamma, delta to Omicron has been driven by the mass vaccination. So making statements like the unvaccinated are protected or the unvaccinated are not are always wrong. This thing is evolving. And that is also the reason why the WHO, our health authorities, have continuously been changing the definitions. Initially, there was some protection against infection. Then it was, no, only protection against disease. Then it was only protection against severe disease, etc. This only reflects the evolution of the virus. And right now, we are indeed in a situation where the innate immune system in the unvaccinated is so well trained that I would say, I mean, it has become rare that an unvaccinated person who is, of course, regularly exposed, lives a normal life, gets moderate disease, maybe superficial symptoms, yes, but that has evolved, and the unvaccinated are now only protected by these non-neutralizing antibodies, a very fragile immunity. So now indeed, the situation has completely changed. It has gone from a clear benefit for the vaccinees compared to the unvaccinated to now a robust innate immune system, immunity for the unvaccinated, and a very fragile protection for the vaccinees. So these things are continuously evolving, and susceptible or not susceptible, we are talking about another virus. We are talking about another immune status in the population. So it's not like you are per definition susceptible or you are per definition not susceptible. These things are evolving. Even an elderly person in good health who has gone through all this has a good trained innate immune system and is not susceptible, right? Whereas he might have been very susceptible at the beginning. See, this is so difficult for people to understand that these things is if what you tell today is no longer true tomorrow, right? So that it's the evolution of the virus and also the evolution of the immune system. We call this the adaptive immune system. The immune system adapts to the situation, but also the virus is adapting to the situation, as we have seen.
How long will it be before it gets bad, and how bad will it get? Do you have any way of knowing that?
To the second question, I can answer the first question. I've become very cautious, not because I've been wrong the first time around. I'm very open about this. What I did not know about is this immune refocusing mechanism, which has basically been self-fueling the immune escape to an extent that the vaccinees now have to completely rely on non-neutralizing antibodies, right? So this was a completely new phenomenon. And now, as I was saying, the virus is now evolving its way around these non-neutralizing antibodies. Frankly speaking, this has never happened. This is completely unprecedented. What I know, based on my immunological analysis, is that this immune pressure is mounting much more slowly. But is this going to take several weeks, several months? Certainly not several years. This cannot be. Frankly speaking, I've taken my precautions already. I'm really very much alerted and I'm really very worried. And if it happens in one of these highly vaccinated countries tomorrow or in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month from now, I will not be surprised. And that is what I basically expect. But if it takes 3 months, 4 months, I don't know. A pandemic can only be terminated if you develop herd immunity. How can you develop herd immunity? It's sad to say, I don't like to say this, is of course the unvaccinated will develop sterilizing immunity. Herd immunity is about the transmission. How can you get the transmission down to a level that you can talk about herd immunity? The unvaccinated, they sterilize this virus. They get infected within probably 24 hours, they eliminate the virus. For the vaccinees, this is not the case, unless they are hospitalized and they are removed from society and they don't serve any longer as a carrier for the virus. And then at that stage, what you will have is not only that you will end the pandemic, you will eradicate the virus. I'm convinced that this pandemic will be ended by eradication of the virus, because the virus will have no way anymore to transmit. It will not be driven in endemicity, but this will be the price we will pay for intervening so massively and with no clue, with no understanding about the biology in this pandemic. We will pay a high price in terms of human lives. That is what I hate to say, but I could not, and I would not write this book if I were not 200% convinced of this, because for me, it's really not a matter of sensation, really. And it's difficult to say right now because people think, some people are even saying the pandemic is gone, it's all over, and look, and the measures have been all relaxed, and hospitalizations and mortality, it's all, more or less within normal ranges, etc. And that is what is very insidious. And that is why society in highly vaccinated countries will be caught by surprise. So that is what it will take, because otherwise you cannot develop herd immunity. It's sad to say, without herd immunity, you don't terminate the pandemic, and certainly not with vaccination.
what country do you think might be safe? You said obviously places like Israel, it's 90+% got vaccinated. Other places, maybe 70, 60. So how many naturally immune people do you need to stop the virus in its tracks? Do you have an idea?
It's again, this is complex as well, because it all depends on, first of all, what vaccines have you been using. The mRNA vaccines are by far the worst. And also, how fast have you been immunizing this population? Remember, when I'm talking about immune pressure, it always has to do with mounting a population level immune response within a limited amount of time. That is what generates pressure. So those countries that have been very aggressively vaccinating their populations, like UK, to some extent US as well, certainly Israel, these are the countries that I think the losses will be the highest.
Is there a certain percentage of unvaccinated people in the population that could lead to herd immunity? Are there places that you think have herd immunity right now?
I'm very often ending my interviews or my articles contributions with Africa will win, because I think it's very difficult to talk about one single country and people will say, yeah, it's not representative, but a continent is very representative. And except for, I would say, South Africa and maybe, of course, the northern, Tunisia and Morocco, they stick to the European policies and strategies. But all in all, Africa, the percentage of vaccination is very low. This is one thing. Secondarily, they do not put all their vulnerable people like we do in the same place, in elderly homes, etc. That is something we do in our modern society. And then also the average age in Africa is way lower than in Europe. So all these things together, I think Africa will simply develop herd immunity without any problem. The highly vaccinated countries is much more problematic. And I think that even a country that has vaccinated only to 30 or 40%, but using mRNA vaccines could face serious losses. Yeah. When you generate the same conditions in different countries, and the mass vaccination and the same type of vaccines, the same regimen, you generate the same conditions in different countries and you apply them to an already circulating virus, these big dramatic waves that I'm talking about could develop independently. It's not like it's going to start in Israel and then it needs to come to other European countries and then it needs to come to the US and etc. No, the virus is circulating. You apply the same stringent conditions of immune pressure on the virus and these waves will develop independently, right? But globally, as far as countries are labeled as highly vaccinated, and is this 30% or 40% or 50%? As I was saying, it depends on the speed of vaccination. It depends on the type of the vaccines. It depends, of course, on some of these countries have been boosting like hell. Others have stopped after 2 injections, for example. So again, these things are complex. And I'm appalled at the simplicity with which health authorities and even scientists have been explaining this to people, right? People need to realize that this is very complex and that it's not just a matter of getting a shot or 2 shots, getting your children vaccinated and you are protected. This, I think we by now know that this is pretty much nonsense, right? That a nuanced discussion should have taken place and it has never taken place, unfortunately. I've never dealt with matters that were that complex and where there has been, in fact, no discussion or only a very polarized discussion.
So is there a solution at this point for the world? Is there a way to prevent this or a way to mitigate it?
I would say, I'm also come to an age where one becomes more realistic. The solution, I think, would still be to put massively people under antivirals, but not therapeutically, prophylactically. Why I'm saying this? Because we are dealing with a virus that is already highly infectious. We all agree. We are dealing with a virus that is resistant to the neutralizing antibodies. We all agree. If this virus now becomes more virulent on top, then we are going to deal not just with severe disease, but with enhanced severe disease. And my fear is that when this happens, that even early treatment will come too late. So if I were in charge, I would immediately treat full populations in highly vaccinated countries. And of course, only the vaccinees with antivirals prophylactically. You don't need to do this lifelong. But these antivirals, together with the sterilizing immunity of the non-vaccinated, can diminish the transmission and could control the virus. As I was saying, always the same rule. Without dramatically diminishing this transmission, you will not end the pandemic. Either you let people die, or you intervene prophylactically with antivirals that kill the virus. That is what you need, killing the virus. Sterilizing immunity, yes, in the unvaccinated, no, in the vaccinees. So the vaccinees should get antivirals to kill the virus. If you kill it, the transmission will be diminished. You will drive it in the misty or even eradicate it.
Are you finding that there are people in your professional circle that are as worried as you are about this? What I did ask you, I think the first time I spoke to you, probably over a year ago now, how people just privately were responding to this, who are immunologists or vaccinologists who understand this as well as you do. And you had said that some people agree with you, but they're not willing to speak out. What's the state of the situation now with the context that you have? Because I know, Gabby, you've worked with organizations, right? WHO, I think, as well.
Yeah, I don't know how it looks like in your place, but what is remarkable right now is the spectacular silence that I'm experiencing. Our health experts, scientists are obviously no longer trying to educate people or raising their voices. The silence is really remarkable. The fact checkers have obviously are out of business, at least as far as I'm concerned. And I can tell you, the book that I've written, I have here in front of me, they will have a hell of a difficult time to fact check this, because this is science, right? And unless they blame me on a personal basis for not having sufficient publications or not being at university or having a background as a veterinarian or whatever, of course, you can always say these type of things. But scientifically, I think many of them are realizing now that we have been way too fast. But the focus is, of course, still on the side effects. And with the side effects, they can still hide a lot of things and come with other reports and other studies. And then you have the question, yeah, which of these reports has most credibility, etc. I don't understand why, but very few people are analyzing this at the population level viewpoint, because I've always been saying, yeah, the side effects is very dramatic and it's good that many people raise their voices and take action. But if this happens, that we have a more infectious virus resistant to the neutralizing antibodies that becomes more virulent, all the side effects are peanuts compared to the damage that this could cause in highly vaccinated populations. Nevertheless, very few people seem to be deeply involved in this. Yes, the molecular epidemiologists are involved, and they are even saying that the situation right now is alarming. There are even peer-reviewed journals that are saying that the variations that we see right now, it's alarming. But they don't raise their voice. Many people are furious with politicians, with health authorities, even with medical doctors. I'm really furious with the scientists who know that these things are evolving, who understand this and are not raising, as I'm saying, it's complete silence. It's complete silence. And okay, they may lose their grants and they may be discredited and whatever, but how can you even pay attention to this type of things when things like what I'm saying are happening? And even if people say it will not happen, I think my book and my argumentation is more than compelling to at least take these things very seriously, right? Take it very seriously. But even that is not the case, because otherwise there wouldn't be this silence. So this is the long answer to your short question. And yeah, silence, that is what is most remarkable right now with regard to those who are scientifically, I would say, involved and have been trying to elicit conversations and debate on this very important topic. Because what happens at the population level affects all of us as an individual, of course.
So I want to go back to something that you have repeatedly said, that it should have been known going into this that you don't vaccinate into a pandemic. So yeah. Is that something that, from the very beginning, the first day it was just obvious to you that should not be done, and you were trying to tell people, what are you thinking? Or was it something that you understood over time?
No, of course, there is many things that I've learned. I'm not going to tell you that everything that I've written in the book, I knew it from the very beginning, not at all. I was also telling you I've been wrong with regard to the timeline, because it was this phenomenon, immune refocusing. Nobody has described this, that this could happen as a result of vaccination or whatever. But the vaccination during a pandemic was crystal clear for me that this would only drive the virus to immune escape. Why are the vaccines that we make typically prophylactic vaccines? Because they cannot sterilize. If you want to vaccinate, you vaccinate somebody. This guy, this lady is starting to mount an immune response that we know is immature, is incomplete. That's the reason why you need to boost. But while they are mounting this immune response, you already expose them. So you can compare this with vaccination during the incubation time of a disease. This is something which is in all textbooks. You will never, ever vaccinate somebody who is incubating the disease. And that is what happened with the Ebola vaccine 6-7 years ago in Western African countries, where they have gone into people, contacts from index cases who potentially were incubating the disease. They vaccinated them with a live vector, right? With the Merck vaccine, a live vector. And there as well, you had many deaths. And I've been writing about this. Is on my website. This paper has gone all over the world, to CDC, to NIH, to WHO, to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Everybody has read it, but no reaction. And this was for me similar. If you vaccinate during a pandemic, you are potentially exposing people to a virus that you're not ready for. Their protection is not ready. It just gives a competitive advantage to mutants that will start to dominate. And that's exactly what we have seen. We have not only seen that different mutants were popping up, but that they dominated, that they were replacing the original, subplacing the original lineage. That has never happened during a pandemic. So yeah, that was very clear for me, although, as I was saying, I learned, of course, a lot of things. That is what is so cynical about the whole thing. It's probably the most interesting and intriguing topic that I've ever been exposed to in my career. But the outcome of this could potentially be very sad, yeah.
So what is your expected range of severity for this outcome? Do you have some way of estimating range of how bad it could be?
You mean in terms of losses, or you mean in terms of burden or for the healthcare system? Or
I mean, in terms of lethality, and how many people who are vaccinated do you think will lose in worst case scenario?
Well, I think that ultimately in highly vaccinated countries, but that is a guess. But I think if you ask me, I think that in highly vaccinated countries, we could lose certainly up to 1/3 of the population. That's what I think, yeah. But it's not, this is going to start tomorrow, and it will most likely start like it has probably or potentially already started right now, that we will see that the hospitalizations will go up, that the number of people will start to have chronic disease, etc. That there will be more, that is certainly what I expect, acute deaths, but that on top of this, we will have to deal with a number of people who are ultimately not going to make it, but where the course is more chronic, right? And all depending on the situation, and all saying this is the highly vaccinated countries. Remember, at some point, I'm very open about this. I don't have this crystal ball. Of course not. I can only base myself on science. But I've been saying that I would not be surprised. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I would not be surprised that the Roman and the Persian and the Greek Empire broke down, that this could put an end to Western civilization even, because these are exactly the countries that have been massively coercing their populations to get this vaccine and to derive an immune response that is completely wrong for this type of pandemic. Everybody knows that I'm not an anti-vaxxer, on the contrary. I believe in the potential of influencing an immune response in the right way. But if you are convinced that vaccines work, like many of these, call them then the pro-vaxxers, And then you would deny that if you use them under the wrong circumstances, they will all of a sudden not have an effect. That is unacceptable. Everybody would accept that if you use a drug for the right indication, that's perfect. A drug that has a spectacular effect. But if you use that drug with a spectacular effect, completely wrong indication, and then say it will, you see, nothing is happening right now, there will be no harm, that is pretty unlikely. So we will have, of course, to see, and of course I don't rule out that I could be wrong, but again, I'm bringing all the scientific evidence in terms especially of immunology. And people can argue, but I can tell you it's not based on one single argument. There's many, it's full in the book. And at least I would think that there is enough scientific evidence to take my message very seriously, which has not been done. And okay, yeah, one will need to let it go in one way or the other. It, as I was saying, since Omicron emerged, it has become for me irreversible. It has been a point of no return, and not at all what our health authorities have been saying. They have been saying, oh, Omicron is great because there is not much of severe disease, it's rather mild, and it is boosting the immunity of the vaccines, right? If you're dealing with complex things, and you don't really understand, you can always take some elements out of this complex puzzle, bring them together in a way that you build a very convincing story to people. And people will say, oh yeah, look at hospitalization, it's pretty, yeah, and Omicron is pretty mild, yes, and it's very infectious, so it's going to induce herd immunity, etc. I'm probably the best place to defend and support the narrative, probably more than any health authority, that people would be really convinced, oh yeah, Geert, you're right, we need to continue this vaccination. But that is the thing that is very tricky when things are complex. And that is also the reason why you have so many different opinions, because people, they do cherry picking out of this very complex puzzle, and they put these things together in a way that they seem to have some credibility and to be likely, but they aren't if you dig very deep.
There's talk now of creating different types of vaccines. And I know you were interested, maybe still are interested, or working on T-cell vaccines.
NK cell vaccines, never T-cell vaccines. NK cell, natural killer cell vaccines.
NK cell vaccines. When Gates and Dr. Fauci are talking about mucosal vaccines, is there any kind of vaccine, including the NK cell vaccine, that you would be able to use to vaccinate into an emerging pandemic?
Yeah, you hear me saying all the time that the critical thing that naturally protects most of the people is the innate immunity. So the innate immunity is, come on, in the textbooks, it's the first line of immune defense, the first line of immune defense. One thing, 25 years ago, people have already shown and published that in contrast to what people pretended 30 years ago, innate immunity can be trained. You can generate adaptive memory for innate immunity. Innate immunity, first line of immune defense, means that it is right here. It is readily available. And secondarily, it is pathogen non-specific. It doesn't care about variant, etc. Of course, it has limitations with regard to the capacity. That is the infantry at the border, right? If the enemy invades massively, the infantry will need to let go some of these invaders that will penetrate. But then you have the special forces, the B and the T cells, that can deal not massively, but can deal very specifically, right? Now, if you train this infantry, right, after a while, I mean, they will be able in their own right, in fact, to prevent the enemy from further penetrating, because now they have learned how the enemy operates. So that means the NK cell, I hate to call it vaccines, it is just a stimulation of this type of innate immunity that is pathogen non-specific in advance, right? It is completely different. It's another paradigm than the classical vaccines. That's why I hate to call them vaccines. It's in fact promoting what we as unvaccinated have done by ourselves right now, namely to train our innate immunity. But what we needed to do was to expose ourselves to the virus, so to say. So that would not need exposure to an infectious organism. And the mucosal immunity, I know, again, this is this type of thing where they think, oh yeah, this is at the border. This is the portal of entry. Therefore, if we mount an immune response there, the virus can be caught at start and it will not even be able to penetrate, and that will be great. These people forget that mucosal immunity, first of all, to keep your mucosal antibodies at a very high level permanently is very difficult. You have to stimulate all the time. Mucosal immunity is not prepared, has not been shaped for that purpose. And secondarily, also, these are still antibodies. These are still antibodies that can drive immune escape, right? So you will still need to mount these antibodies as well. And if they decline, and they decline very rapidly, then again, you have suboptimal titers that drive immune escape, right? It's not solving the problem of immune escape. And of course, in times like this, where there's uncertainty, where the current vaccines are not optimal, you have thousands of new ideas that when I were still a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I would kill these proposals immediately, not based simply on talk, but based on arguments, like I've put them in my book, where in advance, as I was saying, in vaccination during a pandemic, I knew in advance, I didn't need to write this book, that this outcome would be very bad. I can tell you mucosal vaccines, right? It's not because they stimulate immunity at the portal of entry that it will be efficacious. The problem of immune escape will not be solved, and you would need to keep these titers at high level. You would need to immunize people continuously. So this is not a solution, certainly not to implement at the population level.
So the NK cell or stimulating the natural killer cells, that would be a non-specific stimulation. And would that be something that you would do repeatedly or just in case of somebody being at risk? How long would that last?
Well,
what would that look like?
It is pathogen non-specific. So what it does is that it recognizes self-mimicking motifs that the virus is using at an early stage of infection to mislead the immune system. So remember, when a virus infects a cell and it starts to express some proteins at the surface before the virus is fully operational or can leave the cell, is budding, if at that point the virus would be attacked by the immune system, it can no longer replicate. So viruses and other pathogens come with peptides that are self-mimicking and that subvert the immune system so that at an early stage of infection, the foreign proteins that are expressed cannot be recognized. This enables the virus to replicate, to produce progeny. Of course, that progeny will then be taken up by antigen-presenting cells, and then you will have the classical immune response, the B and the T cells. But in the meantime, you have given the virus a chance to replicate. Of course, if you would now attack, so to say, these early peptides that prevent recognition, immune recognition, then of course you can stop the infection at an early stage. But the self-mimicking peptides are only expressed by pathogens. That's why I'm saying it's pathogen non-specific. You would also find them, for example, on tumor cells, where the motifs start to deviate from self motifs expressed on the cell. So they are altered self or non-self altered self or self-mimicking, and they can be recognized by NK cells. You are a medical doctor, you know that many of the cancers, we cure them ourselves. To a large extent is due to NK cells, right? So that is the concept and the principle. My invention a number of years ago related to identifying these self-mimicking peptides in several different types of pathogens. And then what is that many of the self-mimicking motifs are shared amongst a number of pathogens. What you can do by activating these NK cells is in fact at the same time attack a number of different pathogens, provided they share the self-mimicking motif. Of course, this is a concept that the vaccine industry is not interested in. One vaccine that could prevent a number of different pathogens at the same time is not something that is commercially very profitable. And so it remains a topic that is highly attractive, but I don't know whether it will ever be implemented, unfortunately. So
how would it work though? How would you stimulate the NK cells?
What you need to do is that, in fact, the self-mimicking peptides that I'm talking about are not presented on the peptide binding growth of the MHC molecule. The MHC molecule, it has a peptide binding growth. Normal peptides that are taking proteins that are taken up by antigen-presenting cells, digested, etc., they are ultimately presented on the peptide binding growth. These self-mimicking peptides are not presented on the peptide binding growth. By binding outside of the peptide binding growth, they lead to a deformation of the peptide binding growth. That's why classical antigen presentation cannot take place. That is how they subvert the immune system. So I have invented a method that enables these peptides that you can easily synthesize, very easily, right? Peptide synthesis, that you can attach them outside of the peptide binding growth of host cells so that they stimulate the NK cell, because the NK cell will now see that this is a peptide that is not self, it is altered self-mimicking, and it is presented just like you present classical peptides on a peptide binding growth. You have to present them in high density, otherwise it's not going to stimulate the immune response, right? So that is how it works. So it's very easy. It's a very easy technology, but yeah, it goes against main business, not mainstream, but main business, right?
It would also work for cancer.
Of course, some allergens have the self-mimicking peptides, right? So you could even make a vaccine that happened to be directed, an NK cell vaccine that happened to be directed against a number of pathogens and also a number of allergens, because simply the self-mimicking motifs are mimicked. And that is why people now start to look into corona and other viruses, and they're saying, oh, wow, there is parts of HIV in this virus. Oh, wow, there are parts of our human genome. No, all these organisms are sharing to some extent some self or self-like peptides. And so far, we didn't know the role of this peptide. It's basically immune subversion, giving the virus a chance to at least accomplish this first cycle of replication. And then it gets eliminated when the full virus has replicated, it gets taken up by antigen-presenting cells. You get, for example, the T cells that then destroy the infected cell. And that is why we call these virus infections acute self-limiting infections. And that is why also a pandemic is an acute self-limiting phenomenon. It lasts for half a year, and then it comes down and the virus gets eliminated and it becomes endemic, or it becomes even eradicated, right?
Okay, thank you. I know we started a little bit late, but we were able to interview. Yeah, please, I do get your emails, so I'm registered, so hopefully I'll be alerted when the book is finally available and learning something.
Yeah, we will also send a list ahead to the channels that like yours, etc., that were always kind enough to give us an opportunity to convey our message. We have a list of these people, and you're in there. You will be one of the first who will know about availability in the US, I should say, but it's going to be very soon. Yeah, it's really imminent. And yeah, Said, if you can also maybe share the interview, we continue posting it on our website also. Always the same purpose, spreading the word, right?
Absolutely. We'll try to get it up as soon as possible, and then I'll send you a link, and hopefully in the next few days it'll be up. So thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you as well. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.